So to my left you can see the sun setting behind the U.S. Capitol building. And over here to my right you can see the U.S. Supreme Court, which is still under restoration. That's why you see all the scaffolding there on the front. And I thought this would be an appropriate backdrop for the first lecture on Sandel's justice, what's the right thing to do. And you're going to find in Chapter 1, what's the right thing to do, that Sandel presents ethical questions in such a way that he thinks they can be answered, and particularly political ethical questions, thinks they can be answered in at least 3 different ways. Those ways include by looking at welfare, or what's good for citizens, by looking at freedom or liberty, and also by looking at virtue. Virtue has a lot to do with the sort of character we'd like to encourage, if we'd like to encourage a certain sort of character at all. And so he shows these different approaches, or he illustrates them by working his way through 3 different case studies. The first case study concerns potential price gouging, the inflation of prices after a disaster, in this case Hurricane Charley. It also looks at the case of awarding Purple Hearts for different reasons, and arguments that have been provided for and against awarding Purple Hearts to veterans that have suffered PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. And he also looks at the awarding of bonuses to CEOs at companies that have received bailout funds, companies that have remained afloat only because the U.S. taxpayer has subsidized their accounts. And so in each of those cases, we can look at how the different actions and how the different alternatives can benefit the different parties who are involved, how it can make them more or less happy, and that's looking at the general welfare. We can look at each of those cases from the lens of liberty or freedom as a matter of bolstering individual freedom or liberty or constraining it. And we can also look at individual character or virtue. In each of the 3 cases, Sandel concludes that virtue is what we're really after. That's one of the main things. I think that's going to be a main thrust of the book, or we're going to find as we work our way through it whether or not that's actually the case. But when it comes to the price gouging, of course you've got people that need access to fuel and food and those sorts of things, and those who have it can charge a whole lot more for it than they typically would charge because there's a very short supply and people really need it. And they defend doing so on grounds that by charging a higher price, this incentivizes suppliers to bring in more of those sorts of goods, such that people who are able to purchase them will have access to more goods. Well, of course, the argument against it is that it takes advantage of those who are in just a terrible situation. Argument is that the typical free market conditions no longer exist after a disaster, and there's no typical supply chain of the different goods, and so this is a form of exploitation, a form of taking unfair advantage of people who are in a very desperate situation. And so that gives Sandel to conclude that what's really wrong with it is that it indicates greed run amok, that these persons who are charging these very high prices are just bad people, they have a bad character. In the case of potentially awarding the Purple Heart for psychological injuries, the official reasons given by the U.S. military included the fact that PTSD wasn't an intentional result of an enemy attack. But Sandel points out that it's the case that when soldiers' eardrums burst as the result of nearby explosions, that's probably not an intended result of an enemy attack. They intend to completely disable and or kill the soldiers, not simply make them deaf or even temporarily deaf. And so that can't be a good enough reason. But when he digs a little bit deeper, he finds that it seems that what the real objection behind awarding soldiers the Purple Heart for PTSD is that psychological trauma indicates on some level, or at least it's perceived to indicate, weakness. Now, of course, we can't fault soldiers for having psychological trauma after having endured the terrible nature of battle, of having to try to kill fellow human beings and being a target for death of other human beings. But this seems to be the background motivation behind denying psychological injuries that higher status. And last, we're looking at the case of bonuses for CEOs that were at the helm of companies that the U.S. government had to bail out. What's really at issue there isn't the fact that they're receiving more money than they deserve, because as Sandel points out, many of them claim that, well, we lost all that money just because we were caught up in the circumstances. We were caught up in the moment, and it was a, what do they call it, a tsunami of bad decisions and a tsunami of bad conditions that just prevented them from making money and ensured that everyone would lose money. But Sandel points out, well, if you're a victim whenever we fall on economic hard times, you're probably not a deserving benefactor when economic times are good. And so you got to take responsibility for one if you take responsibility for the other. And so what he indicates is that what's really wrong with paying these CEOs, or what is at the heart of our objection, is probably the fact that we don't want to reward failure, that they're losers, that they've lost all this money, and that's not something we want to reward, especially with government funds. Sandel then shifts gears, and he presents a case that philosophers and, in fact, legal students think through quite often, and that's the classic trolley case. And the scenario is, you are standing next to a railroad track, and you see, say, 5 workers working on the track, and you see a trolley that's out of control. And, you're actually on the trolley. There's different versions of this, but in his version, you're on the trolley. And so before you hit these 5 innocent workers and kill them, you have the option to flip a switch and divert the trolley onto another track where there's only 1 worker. The question is, what should you do? Sandel thinks that you would agree that you should indeed flip the switch and kill the 1 worker rather than the 5. Then he asks us to reflect on a slightly different scenario, such that you've got 5 innocent workers working on a track, and there happens to be a little overpass, sort of a bridge over the track, and there happens to be a very heavy man on top of that bridge looking down. And you see the trolleys running down the tracks out of control. You see that there are 5 workers who are going to be killed. And the thought crosses your mind, should I push this heavy man off the bridge such that he falls onto the track and prevents the trolley from killing those 5 persons? Well, Sandel admits that most people actually pause for a second, and they think, maybe I wouldn't want to do that. Maybe I wouldn't want to push that person off. But then he asks, well, what's the difference? In the first case, you thought it was pretty obvious that you should sacrifice the 1 life for the sake of the 5 lives. Why shouldn't you do the same here? And so this begins his exploration of moral reasoning and moral reflection. And he's asking you to engage in something that philosophers have called, but Sandel doesn't call, reflective equilibrium. And that's where you compare your considered convictions, things that you take to be quite true, moral conclusions that you think are unassailable, such as maybe the principle that you should sacrifice few lives for many lives when possible. You take that individual case, you infer that larger principle, and then you compare it to other individual